Hello, everyone. I want to welcome you to Module 2. This is the video for week 7 and 8. And today I want to talk to you about ecumenical cooperation for ministry, building community coalitions. Um, I, I have found in my own work of ministry that this may be one of the more important features. It's often not taught in either seminaries or other kinds of workshop settings, but it really is the backbone of effective community-based ministry and missional ministry when we begin to think about the coalition partners that we can work with and the kind of coalitions we can create in our particular ministry setting. So that's really what I want to address today. 1 Corinthians 3 verses 6 and 7 says this. This is Paul writing, I planted, Apollos watered, but God gave the growth. So neither the one who plants nor the one who waters is anything, but only God who gives the growth. Of course, we see from this text how Paul understood his ministry within a larger coalitional framework. That is to say, he did his part, but it was in partnership, first with God, clearly, because it was the work of God that he was engaged in, but also through other fellow workers like Apollos. And so when we think about ministry, one of the key and critical questions for us to begin to ask is, what resources are available in the community and other organizations and institutions or agencies? What is available in my community, and how can I build partnerships with those resources to get a particular work or ministry or problem addressed? How can I do that? And that's really the kind of thinking that I'm talking about when I talk about coalitional ministry and coalitional type thinking. So let's first think more broadly. Let's look at a model that's been around the United Methodist Church for decades now. And that's something called the ecumenical cooperative ministry. There are some ecumenical cooperative parishes which exist with United Methodists in coalition with perhaps other denominational entities or churches. This is something that happens, but let's think about that ecumenical cooperative ministry. And then once we address that and think about that, I want to kind of bear down just a little more and then think in terms of what I'm characterizing or calling coalitional ministry. So when we use the word ecumenical, of course, its Greek root is the word oikumene, which means the inhabited world, essentially. And so I think a modern equivalent really would be, I haven't seen a lot of linguists do this, but it seems to me that a modern equivalent of this word would be something like the word global. But if I were to create for you, which I've done here for the benefit of this presentation, a practical definition of ecumenical, I would simply suggest it is a cooperative action and interconnectedness of groups within Christianity whose common ground is sufficient enough to maintain cooperation. So it's the common ground upon which these entities or groups or churches stand is common enough and broad enough that they can engage in joint or cooperative action, that there can be some interconnectedness among groups. And so that's essentially what I mean or what I'm referencing when I use the word ecumenical. So ecumenism, which of course is the nominal form of that, ecumenism tends to emphasize commonality and it tends to minimize distinction. And so examples of that historically could be things like the contemporary churches uniting in Christ, used to be called council or commission or consultation, I believe it was, on church union for the years of my early ministry. And then somewhere in the 2000s, early 2000s, the name was shifted. And the United Methodist Church is part of that, as are groups like Disciples of Christ, Presbyterians, Episcopalians, other groups that, and other historically Methodist groups are involved in that. It really was looking at the potential or the possibility of bringing a greater organic unity among these denominational churches. It's sort of stalled, it seems to me, somewhere in the 2000s and hasn't really gone very far since. But that is an example, kind of ecumenical cooperative efforts that United Methodists have been involved in. A more recent one is our joint mutual recognition talks with the Episcopal Church USA. That's another example. And we've got ongoing talks with every major group, Lutherans, Presbyterians, Disciples of Christ. But there has been a significant effort and largely was stalled by COVID, but that's just how recent we're talking that the United Methodist Church has been involved with. I've created this graph. It's part of some larger research and work that I'm doing. I'll get back there for you. Uh, some larger work that I'm doing that I hope someday to turn into a writing project when either time or discipline allows for it. But I look at, there are three kind of arenas of engagement that I look at. The first two are here, and then on the next screen, you'll see the third one. But the first would be egocentrism or self-preoccupation, and that represents a person that's pretty well unengaged. Now, an entity can be that too. A church can be the equivalent of egocentric or self-preoccupied and completely unengaged with anybody else. I often find that particular extreme fundamentalist congregations tend to be in this unengaged category. But then we can look at levels of cooperative consensus. And that's really going to be the heart of the model that I want to talk about today, because this is the theoretical basis for my conceptualization of coalitional ministry that I'll be talking to you about today. And so as I see these, in fact, I've also done some work in showing some parallels that exist with people like Lawrence Kohlberg's stages of moral development. I do have I'm not going to talk about it today, but I have done some work in trying to show how these have a parallel in individual or personal moral development. So there is kind of a moral feature. One's theology, one's morality may gauge the levels of engagement at these various levels that I've painted here. But essentially, what we do is we move from the most particular or the most common to the least common. And essentially, my thesis is this, that if we use this graph, we can determine based on the values that are shared by another organization, what level of cooperation we can engage in with them. Okay, so I'm going to give you some concrete examples of that in a moment so that hopefully it becomes a little clearer for you. So when we look at the area of ideological consensus, we're talking about people who have a very similar ideology, might even be in the same denomination, or might be within the same branch of a denomination. For example, United Methodist, we have United Methodists that might characterize themselves as conservative, some churches that might characterize themselves as moderate, some that might characterize themselves as liberal. And so often you may find that even within a denomination like United Methodism or the American Methodist Church or Presbyterians, for example, you might find that it's easier for churches that share an ideology to have cooperation. So this is the highest level of cooperation. Let me rephrase that. This is the highest level of commonality that we can engage in relative to cooperating with others. And that is to say, we share just about every ideological vantage point. Therefore, cooperation is extremely easy because we have the same mission, same values, same vision, same goals, and it's very easy to occur, okay? So but that's pretty restrictive, isn't it? That would either be people of a particular ideological camp or a particular denomination, and it really would exclude those outside of that. So if one were operating at a level 1 level of cooperative consensus, one could say, I can do this joint venture with another United Methodist Church, which is what the annual conference is, which is really what our connectionalism is at some level. There should be, as I said, that is breaking down a little bit with some of these other subtexts, you might call them, or subgroups within the denomination that might characterize themselves in a certain way. But for most of my ministry, of now a little more than 30 years, it was pretty easy for other United Methodist churches to work with any other because they shared that. The second level is the ecumenical consensus. Now, this gets a little broader. Typically, ecumenically, we would maybe share with Christians who, and remember, ecumenism really happens within Christianity. That's how we use this phrase. So you might be able to share some things with other similar Protestants and maybe even Roman Catholics on some issues. There'll be some issues where we would fall away, but you could do certain things on an ecumenical basis. So it probably would not be very difficult, for example, to have a Bible study in a community with a local Presbyterian church, or a local American Baptist church, or a local even Episcopal church, or Disciples of Christ, or something like that. Might get a little harder have a Bible study with maybe a more fundamentalist or a hyper-evangelical group that might not see things in the same way, or even in some branches of Roman Catholicism. That would start to break down. That's kind of level 2. So there's certain things like maybe some common worship experiences, common Bible studies that people could do together. And then there would come a time that if you move to this next level, some would have to peel off. Okay, the next level, level 3, would be intra-religious consensus. So this would be those things which could be done by any member of the Christian community, regardless of the denomination. So that's a little broader than just ecumenical. That's pretty expansive. And so certain public prayer type of events could possibly happen at this level. Bible studies might get a little harder because you're starting to talk about a lot more diversity of opinion and expression in the way that we understand the Bible or the way that we worship. But certainly like civic-oriented prayer kind of groups might happen. There's a few other things that might happen at this level. But as you can see, it gets a little less focused on our identity and a little more broadly focused on our commonality, to the point of overlooking almost entirely our differences here. Then the next level, level 4, would be interreligious consensus. And that would be things that we could do with people from other religions. Now, some other religions are easier to work with for us than others. For example, Judaism typically is very easy for many, particularly mainline Protestant groups, to work with. Islam still is part of the Abrahamic family of religions and has enough commonality. You might have some interreligious events that you could do together. It gets a little harder. Buddhism's probably easy enough because of Buddhism, meaning that it's not very dogmatic at all. So if it's going to happen, it would probably happen from their side to ours, not so much our side to theirs. Other groups might be a little harder. Hinduism might be a little harder to do some common events, those kinds of things. So as you begin to see, you're getting more diffuse in the focus of your beliefs and what your beliefs are, and you're moving much more toward a common humanity. Okay, so here is religious identity. At this end, it's human identity that's emphasized. And so the last level is humanistic consensus. So at level 5, for example, I don't see any reason why a local United Methodist Church couldn't work with a group that's a stated atheist group if they were providing relief to flood victims. You see what I'm saying? Because the only thing you have to share, and if you're providing relief to a family whose home was burned, or flood victims, or somebody in a disaster, the only real common ground that you have to share to do that is your humanity. So in that sense, you can begin to see how certain things, you wouldn't have a Bible study at this level. Your Bible study is going to probably drop off up here at level 2, but you could have disaster relief here. I remember some years ago, my wife and I were moved by a tsunami event that took place and hit India. And so we could have given to UMCOR, but UMCOR was not yet, although they're pretty quick on the scene. But I did know, because of a local family in our community, a Hindu-based relief group that could get the aid there immediately because of family connections that were already in the area. So my wife and I gave to that, because that was a way, that was humanistic. It was a very humanistic approach because there was a human need and we wanted to reach it, and it didn't matter to us that the people being ministered to, whether they were Christian or not, or believers of anything or not, there was a human need and we wanted to respond. And the quickest way to do that was through a Hindu organization because of the family that we knew. So these are examples. So you just begin to see that there are various levels of cooperation and the consensus around that cooperation, and they each have a different set of values. And as the values become more expansive, they become more inclusive, but sometimes more people drop off. Okay, so up here at level 1, when everybody sees things the same way, there's a whole lot. You can do almost 100% of what you do together. That percentage decreases as you move along. Hopefully that's clear to you. And then, of course, the third area is what I call the universal transpersonal orientation. This is completely unrestricted. There's no restriction whatsoever in the kind of values that a person would share. It just tends to find consensus regardless. which is a lot harder to do. That's a lot. It's even harder to conceptualize, but it probably is a thing. We see it at least in developmental psychology. There's always this kind of universalizing piece on the other side of humanism, and that's what this is reflective of. So let's then get a little more focused. Beyond ecumenism and beyond these levels of consensus, and I would argue that you can use this model to gauge. So for example, if I wanted to ask the question, okay, if I want to do something interreligious, then what groups in my community could I do that with? And what are the kinds of activities that I could do with integrity? Okay, because the issue is your own value integrity as you move through here. So you don't want to lose yourself in any of this. As I said, I had no value qualms at all with supporting a Hindu organization that was doing disaster relief. I had no qualms about that. It didn't violate my values in any way. So you have to ask those kinds of questions. But when we look more specifically, then we think about coalitional ministry. It's a lot more intentional and a lot more proactive than just ecumenism that we've looked at. You could sometimes call them community coalitions as well. And I want to talk about some principles. And we'll revisit these again at the end, but some principles that have emerged in some of my own work in thinking about what coalitional ministry would look like. For example, coalitional ministry is fluid. Now, what I mean by that is it can really emerge wherever it needs to, whenever there's a need. So if there's a disaster in my community, a coalition can build up with a pretty broad range of people involved that can all pull together and get something done. And when the relief is over, then the coalition dissolves. That's what I mean by fluid. Think how effective churches' ministries could be is if instead of taking an institutional approach, which we often do, where we get the board to make a decision and approve a certain ministry, and we get funding and maybe hire a staff person, and we set up this, see how concrete that is? Sometimes ministry needs to just simply emerge based on the need. It just simply needs to manifest itself. And so when it's real fluid, it can do that. For example, in the Fairmont area, this particular year, the year that I'm doing this video, there happens to be a large evangelistic initiative from the Billy Graham organization. Okay, now that's a coalitional ministry because there'll be different denominations and churches that'll come together to stage that event. And when the event's over and the follow-up is finished, that ministry will come to an end. Okay, so it's very fluid in that sense. So there are all kinds of ways that you could think of examples or visualize that, but that's what I mean by it being fluid. Secondly, it's dynamic. And that sort of flows out of the fluidity of it. Because coalitions form for longer or shorter periods around levels of cooperative consensus. So they're not only fluid, but they're also very dynamic, and they're not set in stone. They're subject to change, and they can change as it's sort of building the bridge as you cross it. And there's nothing wrong with that. And so the dynamic nature of coalitional ministry can lend itself to that particular approach. And so I can form a ministry for as long, maybe I work with another church and we do a feeding ministry or a food pantry. And there may come a time that that food pantry no longer continues because of changing demographics, or other ministries can be more efficient at it, or you lose some passion around it relative to your volunteers, whatever the reason, and it simply just ceases to be. But it can also change and morph and take shape. So I know that there are food pantries that became full-blown mission centers at some point. So that's what I mean by dynamic. It really isn't, the parameters of it aren't that set in stone. Not only is it fluid to emerge where the need is, it's dynamic so that it can continue to change to meet the need. Because there's nothing worse than setting up a ministry, the culture changes around you and you just keep slogging it out trying to keep that ministry going when there's no longer a real need for it, okay? Coalitional ministry is also very grassroots in the sense that it should be lay-driven. It should be driven by people with passion. I know at Cornerstone, we have a particular approach to ministry, which is if somebody's feeling led to engage in a form of ministry, they need to organize it, kind of get it started, and only come to us after it's all together. You know, we don't act as gatekeepers here for ministry. Now, it has to share our mission, vision, and values, but provided it does that and people can get their own volunteers and even funding sources, they're going to get a green light from all of us, because we're not about, trying to run everybody through a very narrow opening like gatekeepers. That's not what we're supposed to be about. We're supposed to be about empowering people in their diverse giftedness to do the work of ministry as God calls them to do that. Again, needs to conform to mission, vision, and values of the organization, but beyond that, there's not much that we require. And so for something to be grassroots, it just means it gets closer to the people. And that's what coalitional ministry can be. Also, it has low overhead because it represents pooling of ministry resources rather than redundancy of programs by separate entities. A couple years back, before COVID, we were working with a local denomination, mainline Protestant denomination in our community, and we began having Vacation Bible School together. Well, once COVID lifts, we hope that we can begin to do some other cooperative ministries like youth ministry and some other things that we're engaged in our town. And the reason we're interested in doing that is because why be redundant? Why should we fund and program and recruit volunteers to do a Vacation Bible School, and then the church right across the alley from us do the exact same thing? Now, if the goal was to provide, now, if we all work together, as has happened in Fairmont before, if every church sort of gets together and decides they're going to cover almost every week of summer, now that's a different animal, isn't it? Because they're not really being redundant, they're actually being strategic and trying to provide opportunities for children all summer long. But for the most part, we all live on little church islands unto ourselves, and most of it is just wasteful, inefficient redundancy that we're engaged in. And with coalitional ministry, you don't have as much of that because people are pooling their efforts and pooling their resources, even sharing spaces, which can help a great deal. Also, when we think about these principles, coalitional ministry can bring unity to a community and greater community trust of religious institutions. There's nothing that speaks to the unity of the body of Christ and the validity of the gospel than churches actually getting along with one another in front of the community. When churches fight and fuss and divide from one another, it scandalizes the gospel. The Bible repeatedly warns against that, but Christians have not learned very well that truth. And so when we form coalitional ministries, we really can build credibility and trust from members of the community and how they view religious institutions. We also recognize that coalitional ministry recognizes that ministry belongs to the whole church, not just to one denomination or group. And this can sometimes be a problem. It can be a problem in the United Methodist Church in West Virginia, for example. I've been frustrated over 30 years of ministry that we really have never been that interested. We would rather close some of our small membership churches in remote areas than to even begin to explore cooperative ventures with Presbyterians or Disciples of Christ or little American Baptist churches that might be in the area and might be able to form coalition. And the reason is, in other areas of the state, we're kind of the biggest show in town. And so because of that, we don't often think, if we think, okay, this ministry can't go on, we can no longer support it, we don't think of other options, we just simply close things, because that's the easiest way to do it. But I think as the culture continually drifts from organized religion, which is happening, we're seeing that in polling data, as that continues to happen, it's going to force denominations and denominational leaders to reconsider their models of ministry. And I hope models like coalitional ministry can be an alternative to some of the things that we have done in the past. Also, coalitional ministry focuses on God's kingdom and not our own little kingdoms or egos or personalities, which is a very helpful thing relative to advancing the kingdom and doing the work of ministry in our church. So it's not about us, it's about our community that we serve. So what partnerships are necessary to serve as fully as we possibly can? That really needs to be our operative question. How may we serve our communities as completely as possible, as fully as we possibly can? And usually that's not done well when we go it alone. It just isn't, because many hands really do make light work. Also, a coalitional ministry can build partnerships in the larger community outside of Christianity and the church, like with nonprofit agencies, other interreligious groups, or even government entities, which in the last 15 or so years has that's really coming to its own. There are a lot of kind of religious government partnerships, particularly around areas of dealing with poverty or dealing with human need. And so we can continue to build these partnerships outside the Christian family itself and think about the larger partnerships that can emerge. So coalitional ministry has that very broad view of the larger community. Now, when we think about steps toward building coalitions, some things that I have found are important is first, you need to build your street cred, as it's called, or your credibility with the people in your community. But more importantly, it needs to be within your setting or your church or your placement. I mean, the community, that's sort of the second piece of what I'm going to talk about today. So you can see it in two parts, but we're talking about this kind of credibility. The people that you're serving, that's whether you're a lay person or whether you're a clergy person, you need to have credibility with them in your setting if you're going to start building coalitions. They've got to know that it's for the right reason, that it's not to advance your career or it's not for some other purpose that you're not telling them about, like to merge churches or build a name for yourself or whatever it is. They've got to realize that what you're trying to do is really to benefit the community, and they've got to trust you before you can do that. And so if you're going to build coalitions, you really have to make sure things are secure at home first, meaning in your setting or your church or your placement. Then, as an extension of that, you need credibility in your community. And the only way you get that is to know your community, to know its people, to know its leaders, and to know their needs. And the only way you can do that is to get out in the community, be involved in things. That's time consuming. I find as I've been at Cornerstone Ministries now for 12 years, this summer, I guess, will be, this summer's finishing my 12th year. As I've been here, I found that over the years, my workload has shifted so that much more of my workload happens in the community now than it does within the churches itself. Now, I had to be here long enough for people to understand that and to know my heart and to know that I wasn't just trying to get out of work in the church, but and sometimes leaders have a hard time with that. That might be their model, and they come in and kind of do that, and church people say, well, where's our care? But at the same time, I've also worked very intentionally of building up structures and systems of care within the community of faith. So we have lay people that share in that work of ministry and caregiving. That's very intentional. It's programmatic in our church. And so people are not being neglected. It's kind of like Acts chapter 6, when the deacons were formed. They were formed because the elders recognized that they couldn't have the time to both train leaders and preach the gospel and take care of the members they were making. And so deacons were formed. And so we've done a very similar thing here. And as a result, then I'm freed to do the extensive work in the community that I continue to do, to continue to raise the profile of the church, its ministry, and our credibility among people. And so begin that once you know your community, then you can do just that. That's the third step. Begin working cooperatively in other settings outside the church. Because I really do believe over the long haul, the worst thing for a leader to do is become so preoccupied with his or her own congregation that he or she cannot see the needs within the community. That's a sign of kind of being isolated. You also want to look for opportunities to build short-term cooperative projects or programs with other community groups that might be the foundation for longer-term cooperation in the future. And so when we were working with the church across the alley, we first started having a collaborative Thanksgiving service together. And we did that first. And then we had some collaborative musical things. And then eventually we could do collaborative vacation Bible school. And I hope that our cooperation continues to deepen over the years as we do other things together. But we started with some very short-term coalitions. And then we can recognize that building upon those, we can then have the credibility to have more longer-term coalitional approaches to the needs of our community. Number 5, you want to cast a vision with other community leaders to develop coalitional partnerships. So I often talk about this with other community leaders and try to get them to kind of catch the spirit of that vision. So that's something that they start to prioritize. And it does help over time. to do that. So I try to cast that vision with other community leaders. And then you want to stay connected to the values of the coalitional ministry model, which are, we looked at them already, that they're fluid, dynamic, grassroots, low overhead, unity orientation, ecumenical, kingdom focused, and humanitarian. And so if you can kind of stay connected to those values as you're thinking about how you can form coalitional ministry, and if you could use something like the levels of consensus that I've developed to evaluate what consensus or what coalitions are possible within your community and what the nature of those could be, that may help you in thinking about the kinds of ministry that you want to begin reaching the community with. Because remember, we've talked a lot about being a missional church, and sometimes to do the work of a missionary is to build coalitions and partnerships. That's how missionaries have done it since we've had missionaries. And it's just the same if you're talking about your own local church being in mission to the community. You have to do the exact same thing. Okay. Now, in conclusion, then let me say this, that this ministry model reflects the culture of Appalachia. I do think it's translatable. I think it can work a lot of places because I think it actually reflects a larger culture of kind of small communities. And while we have big cities in the world, we have big cities in the country, most of the people that live in the United States of America actually live, I'm not talking about by volume, but I'm talking about space, because you have high populations in cities that rival rural populations. But if you look at the map, most of the map of the United States is rural. And so that's where a lot of people are going to live. And so we need to use models that reflect that culture. And Appalachia has its own take on that culture. And I think it's a corrective to kind of the big box mentality that I think leaves so many of our ministries out. It seems to me that sometimes denominational leaders of all stripes can get enamored by building bigger and better, and instead of coalitions, they think mergers and all of these kind of things, and they talk about lots of big ministry, and mostly that leaves most of our small churches out. I'm finding in my own setting, we are three relatively small congregations. We're not tiny, but we're relatively small congregations. But even as a charge, as we built strong coalitions with each of the three churches within the charge, we're doing some pretty big church ministry. And that's a wonderful thing. And that's because of this coalitional model that I'm talking about. It also is a humble approach to ministry, because as I suggested to you, sometimes United Methodism in West Virginia has been ecumenical, but not very coalitional, because we were one of the biggest shows in town. And so we didn't have to be. And so we need to think about that. What does it mean to meet the needs in our community, and who could our potential partners be, whether they're United Methodist or not? How do we think outside of just our denominational structure? Now, there are churches that don't share enough of our values that we can be that cooperative with certain things, but we could be cooperative with others. As I suggested, once you move kind of past level 3 or so of my levels of cooperative consensus, the value sharing kind of falls off, meaning that you move much more toward humanitarian types of things. And so that's true for some organizations. I know that there are organizations in Fairmont or churches that I've cooperated with for a specific task that were far to the right of me, far more evangelical than I am. But there were things that we could share in common. And the same thing is true about groups clear out of our own Christian faith entirely that I could work on the other side, that I could work with because there was some common ground. So, you just have to, these things again are dynamic and fluid, and you just have to assess those. The key is to hold your own values intact. Do what you can do with integrity and holding your values intact. And when you find you couldn't hold your values intact, then the levels of cooperation drop off. That's just the way that it works. And that's going to be different for every congregation and for every group of leaders. I also want to suggest that this model provides a great opportunity to see community needs outside of the box. When we start working with others, we find out needs that we didn't know existed, and we can be much more engaged with the real and felt needs of the people within the communities that we serve. So essentially, that's what I wanted to share with you today, kind of giving you a theoretical foundation for how we can build community coalitions. I really think that's where the future of our church is at, particularly as we continue to see demographic change, millennials and beyond. We're starting to see far less affinity with membership, church membership, and some of the things that were staples for United Methodist. For me, growing up as a person, will be 52 years old this year, that's the church that I grew up in, a church where membership was important and programs were important and uniformity was important all up and down the way from the general church all the way down to the local congregation. But we're working with a group of people that do not see the world that way. And we can stubbornly cling to that model until they stubbornly close every one of our churches. That's what can happen. Or we can begin to understand how is it that we can stay true to our values and find creative ways to continue to witness to the gospel to new generations of people as they come along. So I hope you found this informative and helpful. It's, again, my joy to journey with you during this time. And I hope you all take care, and I look forward to seeing you the next time. God bless you.